Opinions discussed on Canadian Love by our guests are not representative of the crew or host. Facts may be referenced that we cannot back up, so please don't listen to everything you hear on the internet. Resources mentioned in the video will be listed in the description below. Please do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Thank you.
Today on Canadian Love, we will be interviewing Sammy, a spoken word poet, on their tour across North America. Sammy is passionate about issues like religion, Israel versus Palestine, Islam and Judaism, and gender. Let's go show him some Canadian love. But first, I'll be right back. All right, so Sammy, thank you so much for joining us here on Canadian Love. We are really excited to hear your story today.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Now you're on a tour right now. We caught you just in the midst of your spoken word tour.
Yes. So I've been on tour for the last 3 weeks. I started in Regina to Portland, Vancouver. Did a number of shows in the States: Kansas City, Denver, Colorado, Boise, Idaho, Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yeah.
I've just been a little bit all over the place. So yes, this week I'm in Toronto and I'm featuring at the Toronto Poetry Slam tomorrow night at the Drake Hotel.
Nice. Okay, I'll have to throw out an Instagram on that.
Cool.
And these are your books, right? These are books of your poetry.
Yes.
May I read the cover?
Yes, absolutely.
Bliss in die, unbinging the underglow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, and then we've got this one here.
The title might not be as apparent on that one because it's a proof copy. But
Disaster in Die, an Overdose Sunrise?
that is correct, yes.
Nice.
So these are
Beautiful.
2 books that were published by a publisher based out of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, and they're about, one was published in 2018.
Swimming with Elephants?
Yes,
Yeah.
that is correct. One was published in 2018. Bliss and Die was published in 2018. Disaster and Die was actually published earlier this month. So
Wow.
they kind of work as a prequel, sequel. There's a very cohesive and almost symbiotic relationship between the two. One talks primarily about my trauma with eating disorders. Suffered from eating disorders for most of my life.
Yeah.
A year later, I'm on my road to recovery. However, I wrote Disaster and Die, an Overdose Sunrise following an overdose on psych meds that happened sometime last year. So it just goes to show that the relationship between the two, that the journey between trauma and recovery, or pain and peace, are they're not linear.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much the position that each book in its own way takes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like an incredibly personal and formative experience that you're sharing through your poetry.
Absolutely. It's been a very I'm a very confessional poet, quite political as well. But I mean, the two go hand in hand based on my struggles with identity, but also playing a bigger part in the society or the environment that I grew up in. So
Definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask a bit more about yours? And so just for our, this is, I'm supposed to say this every time.
That's fine.
Usually what we do is we start with a brief sort of overview of the things that you believe politically, and then we dive into your sort of personal story, your lived experience, so that we can then come back around to your more political views and really understand where they come from.
Yes.
But we're also very flexible about that.
That's fair.
So can I guess, before I ask that question,
Okay.
how would you, if you were to describe yourself as a human or as a Canadian or as your political views or your ethnic background or anything like that, how would you sort of describe yourself?
I would describe myself primarily as a human being,
Yes.
Existing within the larger, divided but unified framework that both that connects and separates us. So, despite the fact that I am a human first and foremost, and I see that human connection exists with each individual, regardless of their identities or their political views, I do acknowledge the fact that there are specific terms that I identify with that might differ from other folks. So I believe that those terms are important to further define identity as well as positioning, as well as basically to as a form of reclamation and resistance to the status quo, which essentially erases us. So it's again, there's a duality there between erasure and anonymity, as well as identity and reclamation.
So you feel that the status quo, I assume you mean by that sort of the way we are taught to be, is sort of erasing our individuality.
Correct.
And then finding your identity is a way of reclaiming that.
Exactly. I think that in each of our lives, there's a personal journey as well as political to help find ourselves and place us not simply with those that we share our views or share facets of our identity, but also to further expand our own knowledge and our own awareness of other people's struggles and other people's identities and their own positioning politically.
100%. So, and I mean, I like that you sort of commented how there are parts of identity that can be divisive.
Yes.
But what you're saying now is that part of the reclamation struggle, as you're putting it, is to reclaim your own identity, but also to seek to understand other identities, so that you avoid the divisive isolation piece.
Yes, in order to further, it helps us to further define who we are. So it establishes those boundaries, so that we can recognize where our identity ends and those of others begin.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I just, I mean, I feel like this is something that you live every day, and I think I've got an idea of where you'll go with this. But for anyone who doesn't, so why is it necessary to find your identity and to reclaim that? What do you like? If you were trying to sell someone watching this, like, here's why you should spend some time really reclaiming your identity and really, understanding other identities as well. Why? What does that do for us?
What that does for us is that helps with first and foremost visibility for other folks. So, for instance, I'll throw an actual example. Being agender and not subscribing to the gender binary. I myself, as assigned male at birth, an AMAB person, identifying as agender and finding my way and navigating through life, it helps other folks connect with me in that way, and it helps me connect to other folks as well and share our experiences, our similarities, but also our differences, so that we can eventually come to that point of cohesion and compromise. So that's why it's absolutely important that one asserts themselves in the identity that they discover through discovery of other people, and connecting with their own life experiences as well as their own positioning in the greater status quo in society as a whole.
Yeah, so in a way you're reclaiming your own identity, partially for your own fulfillment, but partially to help others who have a similar identity and are trying to reclaim theirs, and it just helps them to connect with people of example.
Precisely. It helps reinforce that, if anything.
Can I ask, you've been mentioning that you've been struggling with identity as well. You said agender.
Yes.
I love the idea of, gender binary as something that people subscribe to, like a YouTube channel or a mode of belief that you do or do not subscribe to. Can you talk a bit about subscribing to gender binary or not?
So the tacit implications that gender, living in a society that is primarily, if anything, predominantly Judeo-Christian, and the sacred texts of each of those, whether it's Christian scripture or the Torah, which is in Hebrew scripture, making references or setting the baseline of two genders, both male and female. It's a social construct, if anything. It's not something that we as a species or as having the cognitive abilities as well as the environmental impact that we do have is something that we should necessarily follow. If anything, The Talmud, which is actually just based on the study of ancient scripture.
Sorry, what is the Talmud?
The Talmud is a collection of books created by rabbis that further assessed and dug deeper into the original books of Moses, created more sacred texts, which are philosophical analyses and exploration into the symbolism of the books of Moses, the 5 books of Moses in the Torah.
Yeah.
So the Talmud actually makes reference to 6 different genders. So
Wow.
it's when
What?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's lean in here. So first of all, just for our, many of our watchers are atheist, agnostic,
Yes.
or Christian, and
Yes.
grew up in a Christian society.
Yes.
So the 5 books of Moses.
Yes.
Is that the part of the Bible that deals with Moses as well? Like, what's
the 5 books of Moses are the core 5 books of the Torah, which are the quintessential, if you will, sacred texts of the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
The book of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, not in that specific order, but those are the 5 core books.
Okay.
Yeah,
which are also I think the first 5 in the Bible as well.
Exactly. So in the Old Testament, as it is referred to, we as Jewish folk refer to it as Christian scripture. But I mean, the two go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But in the Jewish faith, yes, those are the 5 books that essentially tell the creation story, the story of Exodus when Jews were slaves in Egypt under Pharaoh.
Yeah.
It talks about the resistance and the journey that led to the biblical land of Israel, as well as all the stories that are intertwined therein. So that's essentially what the 5 books of Moses or the Torah references.
Which, okay. So that makes a lot of sense. I love the idea of the Talmud as, am I saying it right? Talmud?
The Talmud, yes.
Talmud.
Yes.
I love the idea of the Talmud as sort of like the follow-up document where the essentially spiritual researchers known as rabbis were like, okay, we've got this base, like let's dive in here, let's unpack some things. And they found 6 genders.
Yes. So there was I mean, the further analysis is that when you listen to the story of creation and the story of Adam and Eve, and it was further determined based on the analysis that they came to that according to the Talmud, that there are 6 different genders, that each of the genders holds, certain levels of masculinity versus femininity, and incorporating biological elements as well. And so, so there are actually, I'm not familiar with all of them, but androgynous is one of them, which is where you get the term androgynous.
Yeah.
I believe tum-tum is another one. Yes, tum-tum.
Tum-tum.
Yes.
Sorry guys, I'm tum-tum gender. I just want to be able to say that.
And they each have their own different characteristics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is so cool. And I love the idea that, the book of Moses, Torah, the first 5 of the Bible, were sort of, they were like, okay, well, we're going to set this in stone, because I guess that's the paradigm that they were written in.
Yes.
Of, hey, there are 2 genders.
Yes.
Y'all better follow this. And then the rabbis dove in and said, whoa, okay, based on the same 5 things, there's actually 6.
Yeah, and I'm not. I mean, I'm not familiar with the actual certain parts or
the details.
Yeah, the details of when the story of Adam and Eve was described, but those characteristics were not essentially saying that these are the only 2 biological genders that exist. I mean, not to erase intersex folks, of course, but those were described, and therefore they were further elaborated on later on.
Yeah.
Not just as static characteristics, but more as baseline or foundational definitions. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, and I mean, this is sort of an aside, but my thing with that is, I was raised Christian, and I would still consider myself to be fairly spiritual overall. But the Genesis story, we didn't have a scribe there with Adam and Eve being like, this is what happened. Mm-hmm. We had people, however many years later, say, how is the world created? Mm-hmm. What's that, God? Okay, yeah. So Adam and Eve,
Yes.
because those are great names.
Yeah.
There was this tree and there was this apple. Like, so I think it's all more metaphorical than some people seem to think.
Absolutely. There's a lot of mythological symbolism that those scriptures represent. My position on the gender binary as a whole and the social construct that creates it or enforces it is that those mythological symbolic frameworks have been used to enforce and further marginalize not just a blank slate baseline, but also when you look at other cultures as well and the gender diversity that existed long before. These specific scriptures were widely distributed and publicized and societies established. So there are various cultures across the world that believe in gender diversity and multiple genders as well. So to have society in that which we live in right now in Western society, which is predominantly Judeo-Christian as a foundation, to enforce those gender binaries and effectively erase any diversity that might exist in other cultures is also problematic. So.
That's fair, yeah.
Yeah.
Other cultures had non-binary genders as well.
Correct.
And I also, like the cisgender thing, there are some men and women who deny that this is part of their experience. I have not lived their experience, but I feel that they are just not aware of it. But, I know that I grew up being taught by every movie I watched that as a male, I should not be in touch with my emotions. I should be strong, rugged, career-oriented, get into fights, not emotional, not parenting-oriented. I should leave that to women, but I should get really rich or really strong so that I can find a woman who will give me sex and babies in exchange for fighting for her and giving her money.
Precisely.
So, I feel that in addition to non-binary, to non-binary people, that has also affected all the binary people as well.
Precisely. It's a social construct that imposes these expectations, these exigencies that are unreasonable because they are socially constructed. They are constructed by the status quo for the purpose of for procreation and for genetic continuity, which is the same reason that those who adhere to that limited ideology that that homosexuality is wrong because it does not further procreation and continuity of the species of humanity, and so therefore it must be wrong, it must be abolished, and anybody who engages in such acts must be vilified.
And I'm glad you used the word limited because I really think if you go, well, homosexuality is wrong and there are only two genders and men should be providers and strong and women should be beautiful and just there to have babies, that, or, even a light, watered down version of that, like, oh, you're a woman, you should be a nurse, that's a great career for women, that sort of thing. Any version of that it's really just limiting humans from doing what we want and being who we want to be and exercising our potential.
Precisely.
Which I want to, and if I may, and only say what you feel like.
Absolutely.
But you've been talking about your identity struggles and you being agender. I want to get back to that a little bit.
Okay.
Like, what was it like? When did you sort of figure out that you were maybe agender or?
Well, it's been a lifelong journey, I would say. I only began openly identifying as agender as of a few years ago. But it's a direct. It's a culmination of everything that I've endured and experienced from as far back as I can remember. Whether it was, when I was, immersed in the education system and interacting with, other males and their affinity towards. Cars or certain types of music and behaviors that were the entry level steps into very misogynistic tendencies and not subscribing to that. It was also because of my cultural background being Middle Eastern,
Yeah.
I was, I come from a very traditional family, and so the supposed enforced implied narrative is that I, get married in my early 20s, and I get married to, a cisgender woman, and my purpose is to be, fruitful and multiply. So as the saying
Nice
goes.
callback to the Bible.
Precisely, yes, exactly. So that is not something I subscribe to either.
Yeah.
I've never felt, compelled to bring children into this world, especially with the current state of affairs, which we'll dive into, just to be absolutely brief. But, there is that. And it's also the various behaviors and those impositions and exigencies that are that men are conditioned toward, such as dominance and physical strength and all these unimportant and insignificant tenets that are very static and limited. So again, lifelong journey, and it's something that I've felt strongly towards. And I mean, there's a when you go into sexuality as well, there are so many other factors that play into that as well.
Yeah. Can I ask, just for just for people who are as uninformed as I am, agender?
Yes.
What exactly does that mean?
So agender is the non-existence or non-adherence to anything or any construct within the gender binary or gender diversity. I look at it as more of it's the same, just as atheism is, the lack of adherence to, any specific static doctrine in religion. Atheism, agender. So
that makes sense.
Yes.
Can I ask, is that, so my relatively limited experience raised as a cis male, still a cis male, is that, I mean, it's obviously not asexuality. It's totally separate from sexuality.
Correct. Asexuality refers to
not wanting to have.
Yeah, sexual connection and specifically towards towards that connection. Agender is more personal and affirmative in one's personal identity, as opposed to how they connect sexually with other individuals.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And now that obviously no one's journey has ever done.
Correct.
Now that you've sort of achieved this place where you're fulfilling your identity to an extent, and you're expressing it in beautiful ways. Can I ask? You mentioned eating disorders and stuff.
Yes.
It sounds like a challenging struggle. Was it related to that?
A lot of it was. A lot of it has been intertwined with my body dysmorphia, which when I look in the mirror, I don't know what it is that I look like. I see a physical being there standing, but that's only because logically I know that a mirror is meant to reflect what it is that appears in the mirror. There's a dissociation that occurs between how it is that I present myself, or how it is that I exist, with how it is that I am perceived, or how it is that I exist to other people.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you look in the mirror and you go, "Who's this?
Yeah.
That's not what I look like."
I don't recognize the person on the other side of it, and a lot of that has to do with much of the of the physical beauty standards that we are also conditioned with, which are part and parcel of the enforcing of a gender binary, where women are told to look a certain way and men have to look a certain way, and everybody has these expectations, and so a lot it has to do with that.
I mean, that sounds emotionally very, very challenging to be like, this is my body, but
There's it's an ongoing struggle that I'm on a constant path for recovery, thankfully, at this point, but it took a lot of self-exploration as well.
I bet, yeah. And I have every respect for what you've been through in this struggle.
Thank you.
And one thing, if I may.
Yes.
So you've gone very far into exploring yourself and your self-image and your self-awareness. And one thing that I always want to know is, as someone who's been through this and has lived that, for people who, have had an easier time and, were born cis and are still fine with that, but haven't done that self-exploration either, is there any takeaway that you have from all this that you'd like to express?
I mean, with respect to those who have either not gone through that depth of exploration within themselves or connecting with other folks, or those who have attempted to and simply discovered that there's no disconnect that exists. The takeaway that I would share is that any level of exploration or information, so that folks are empowered with the knowledge, not just necessarily the knowledge of other people's experiences, but their own capability of exploring further. Any venture into that is perfectly healthy as human beings, as thinking and feeling and having the philosophical capacities that we have. I don't believe that any human being on this earth truly is limited in the ability to explore themselves or their identity or how they fit in the bigger picture. I mean, there's no real way to quantify that, really, but I mean, it all depends on the environments we live in. And thankfully, I live in an environment, or I've been exposed to and grew up in an environment where I have the opportunity to explore, to connect with people from different walks of life, to people with different experiences, and sort of find myself through other people and their own stories. So as long as somebody engages in that, I mean, really they're not at a loss for anything to spend that time.
What I just thought of, and this might be terrible, and hopefully my team won't cut it out afterwards. But something that occurs to me is, I have a lot of left-wing friends and a lot of very good friends who are also on the right wing,
Mm-hmm.
and what you're saying makes me wonder if maybe, cisgendered rich white people aren't the bad guys because they're cisgendered rich white people, but maybe are the bad guys because by having been, given less struggle in life and having had, not that there's not to, everybody's struggle is important, everybody's struggle is, I have every respect for, but having been forced to do slightly less self-exploration, if they come off as a douche, it might just be because they weren't forced to delve deeply into their psyche as someone who has had to struggle with identity might have had to do.
Precisely. That's exactly what I believe. I don't believe that anybody who comes from that degree of privilege, whether they're they're white or economically stable or male or able-bodied, they're not regarded as the enemy of the left. I don't necessarily. I have tons of rich white male friends. So
there, yeah.
To spin that whole, I have tons of friends of color thing out there.
I love it. Yeah, we've totally reversed that. That's amazing.
Exactly. That's part
of. Oh, guys, it's fine. I'm cool. I've got lots of rich white male friends.
Yeah,
they're fine.
I can talk about them all I want.
That's awesome.
They're not regarded like the opposition isn't to them. It's to the systems that are in place to privilege them above anyone else. And I mean, when you look at systemic privilege or systemic oppression, on the flip side of it, it's the individuals that have that degree of privilege are not should not be vilified by any means by those who are more progressive in our thinking or who are who are marginalized in a certain way, just as those who are systemically marginalized should not be vilified or oppressed in the ways that differ from those who are privileged. So that's where the schism exists between oppression and privilege. It's not the individuals that have more or have less, but it's all about being able to engage in that level of self-exploration and realize that in those ways that you are privileged, there are other ways in which you are oppressed. And
Yeah,
again,
definitely.
it's not to say that, rich white men don't have, aren't marginalized in other ways.
Sure.
Yeah.
Very repressed emotions, if I remember my childhood correctly.
Yes, exactly.
But I think that's a great overall message. I'm just going to address the wide shot for a second and just say, like, so don't, if you believe you're progressive, that's amazing. Keep helping people. But don't get mad at people who you feel are entitled. Just love them anyway, but work on the system that you feel is entitling them. And if you, if you find yourself feeling marginalized, whether it's as a white person who was not given the privilege of being rich, or whether it's someone who's not privileged, don't get mad at the people. Don't get mad at refugees for taking your jobs. Love them anyway and work on the systems that are the systems are the issue, not the humans.
Exactly. The systems are the issue. Unfortunately, there's a certain amount of those who are privileged that maintain and uphold those systems so that they can retain their privilege, as opposed to sacrificing any of it so that they can better connect with other people. So once they see that the system is something that reinforces their privilege, many will continue to hold on to that.
You know what though? I bet it doesn't make them happy. I bet if they started working with others who aren't privileged by the system to let go of their prioritization of material wealth and let go of the system that they have been fed, they would probably be a lot happier.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you define as happiness, because it's a very loaded, very subjective term.
That's fair,
They may find that their happiness comes from being the dominant gender and having economic wealth and just physical strength, or any of those absolutely, as I call them, the mundane things that give them that privilege. So
I can't help but wonder, and this is more, this is more blasting into my own theories on things, but I can't help but wonder if, the privileged, like everyone else, have been sold on these ideas of success and sold on these things that will make them happy, and that we're all running around trying to make ourselves happy by getting more money and having better jobs and having more status and having a red sports car. But that actually, that has all been, sadly, a distraction from what actually makes people happy, which I've found is connecting with other humans, being loving, and feeling that you've made other people's lives better.
Precisely. I firmly agree with that stance, because those things, not just based on my experience, but when you look at us as a species, or as humans, like as a collective species, those things that like aspiring to or trying to acquire those material, like the superiority, doesn't necessarily, it doesn't provide me with any degree of happiness. I mean, I used to identify as male. I used to, I suppressed my queer identity for a long period of time under the guise of, I'm supposed to be male, I'm supposed to, and I, despite the fact that I've gone through a much longer period of poverty in my life, I think back on, when I had, when I was, more economically stable, it didn't provide me with any level of happiness. So I have that exposure to, what it is that privilege looks like.
Yeah.
And I can firmly say that, like yourself, I also believe that connecting with other individuals and learning to share and communicate, and that's what will lead humanity to evolve. Because of the system and the way that it's designed and the way that it's been enforced and the way that it's been implemented, I feel like this decline of humanity, I'm a little bit of I don't want to say a doomsday theorist or anything like that, but I do see that humanity and the way that we interact with one another is on the decline. Where I mean, if you look at global conflicts, if you look at the environment, if you look at the economic disparities that exist between us, these are all manifestations of our de-evolution, and we should be aspiring to achieve more than that.
And maybe it's the systems that are in place, but also what we are sold on in terms of get more wealth that is holding us back.
Precisely.
And with that, so the systems that are supposed to be providing us wealth also provide us with reason for conflict. If I may ask,
Yes.
and only say what you want to, obviously, but you have a Hebrew letter tattooed on your hand.
Yes.
We've talked about the Torah and the other one.
The Talmud.
Talmud,
Yes,
thank you.
you're welcome.
So would we say that you identify as Jewish?
I identify as spiritually Jewish and culturally Arab.
Really?
Yes.
That is a very interesting blend, given the conflict between...
Given the conflict, you would one and many people would assume that the conflict that exists is between Arabs or Muslims and Jews.
Yeah.
That is not at all the case. I am very one of my subject matter fortes is the current conflict in the Middle East, or in Israel, Palestine, as it would seem. So I've connected with a spiritual side of Judaism that is very liberating and very liberal as well. And so I've connected with a lot of the spiritual tenets that I connect with and I identify as an individual. However, I was brought up in an Arab household, a very Arab conservative household, and
Wow.
I was grown, I was raised in a sect of Islam, actually.
Wow.
A very secretive, very low-key sect of Islam. Not like...
when you say sect of Islam, what does that mean?
So it means like a subdivision. It's like you have your Lutherans, or you have like...
Right.
Yeah.
Can you say it was secretive?
It was a very secretive sect of Islam, actually.
Like culty?
Well, sort of culty in its doctrines, but in all honesty, and I mean, this is the Druze faith, and I could go on for like 3 hours talking about this, but the long and short of it is that the Druze faith, those who are followers of the Druze faith, don't have access to the sacred texts. It's one that is governed entirely by the elders, or the mashayikh, the sheikhs of the faith. So they're think of them as like the spiritual leaders, the rabbis.
The priests, kind of
the priests. And they basically, they have access to the sacred texts. The adherents or the followers are called the ignorant. And so their role in the faith is, they still identify as Druze, but all they have to go on is the teachings and the studies that the mashayikh, the sheikhs, the elders, the holy men have access to. So
it's very controlled by whoever gets to be the holy men.
Precisely. And I was raised in a household where my grandfather was a sheikh. So having been spiritually unfulfilled, I ventured into a great period of time in my life where I was studying different religions. Everything from, I went to Catholic school, for instance.
Wow.
I studied the Quran. I even delved into Levian Satanism, as an example, just for the philosophy.
Okay.
And so, I found my home in the Jewish faith.
Yeah.
And the spiritual teachings. Now, how that's manifested in, current events, and how, how there is that like how Arabs and Jews have basically been pitted against one another. That has nothing to do with religious conflict. It is not a religious conflict in the slightest. Jewish people of the state of Israel and the Arabs of the state of Palestine are not in an a religious ideological war. It is just the way that settler colonialism, just as we have seen here on Turtle Island, manifested, from 1492 and onwards with colonization against the indigenous people here on Turtle Island.
And my understanding of that is that the English and French took different groups of the indigenous people of Turtle Island
Yes.
and set them to essentially fight each other for the English and French.
Precisely.
So who's setting the Israeli people and the Palestinian people? Who's setting them against each other?
Well, it's it's the way that the religion itself has been twisted into an ideology which is just over 100 years old. It's called Zionism.
Okay.
Yeah. So Zionism is it's based on an ideology that awards that reclaims the land of Israel for the Jewish people, exclusively for the Jewish people. And Zionism in and of itself isn't so much the problem. It's more political Zionism and how it's enforced and how it's and how it is being weaponized against the indigenous people of Palestine. Palestine being a colonialist term as it is, because the state of Palestine was, a British mandate after the fall of the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
And so the long and short of it is that political Zionism and how it's manifested today and how it's engaged in today, that is the ideology that essentially grants Jewish privilege and superiority over the land because of biblical references that that designate that land as belonging to the Jewish people.
Okay, so aside from the theoretical benefit of the Jewish people of the State of Israel, who would theoretically have access to those biblical points, who is gaining from this conflict? Who's at work making this conflict, aside from the Zionism, someone must have invented Zionism, and if it's 100 years old, it makes me think that maybe it was given to the Jewish people of the State of Israel as essentially to weaponize them.
Yes, to weaponize. So Zionism was invented in the late 19th century by Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl being a very prominent individual in European Jewry. And the way that Zionism as a philosophy, as a doctrine, as an ideology has been weaponized, only has served to the benefit of the colonialist entities, the British and the French. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century, the lands that are currently Lebanon, formerly Palestine, Jordan, and Syria were divided as based in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the whole land was divided. 2 states were given to the French, 2 states were given to the British.
Wow.
So essentially, it's settler colonialism being done under the banner of Judaism, but it serves to benefit the colonization and those who are superior in that realm, so the British and the French.
Okay.
Yeah.
And has that been taken over by the Americans and the Russians now?
Yes. There are geopolitical implications that would pit the Americans as well as the British and the French, the Western powers, over the Russians. Yes.
Okay.
So there are geopolitical implications, especially when you consider there are so many factors that come into play in this. The historic and consistent over hundreds upon hundreds of years of oppression against the Jewish people.
Yeah.
When you look at the pogroms in Russia against Jewish people,
Right.
Zionism was meant to be like a form of empowerment to the Jewish people in order to reclaim the land of Israel as their own home, as a safe haven, as the promised land in biblical terms.
So it was never meant to be weaponized. It was meant to be this empowering call to a people who had lived through, among other things, World War II.
Yes.
And concentration camps.
And the Holocaust. Yes, exactly. And like I said before, the ideology of Zionism is never meant to. It was never meant to. If you look at the military occupation of Palestinians today, as well as the ways in which they are dehumanized by the State of Israel, versus the original ideologies that were born in Zionism back in the late 19th century. There were a lot of Zionist political figures that in theory, in speech, were actually very sympathetic and very understanding for the need of equality and equity with the Palestinian people who live there. However, over time it has degraded. I mean, and there are a lot of, again, geopolitical factors that come into play that are essentially, I mean, when you look at the rise of, anti-Semitism still exists to this day. There are, there are Jewish people who are being killed just for being Jewish. Synagogues and yes.
Okay. Well, yeah.
Even
okay,
in this
yeah.
day and age, I mean, like several decades after the Holocaust and the fall of the Third Reich, for God's sakes, it's so.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this is a tangent that we can, further.
So let's finish it because we're almost out of time as well.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Well, you're too interesting.
Thank
Sammy.
you.
We could let you go for hours. But so as an Arab Jew, can we say that?
Jewish Arab.
Jewish Arab. Sorry. As a Jewish Arab.
Yes.
What is I've posted about it and been like, what's the way forward? And I've had a lot of people say, oh well, the Israel and Palestine have always fought, have always hated each other. Doesn't sound like that's the case, and will always fight and will always hate each other. I don't want that to be the case. So as a Jewish Arab, what's the way forwards? How can what will we ever be able to change it, and what would have to happen?
Well, first of all, the external elements such as the meddling of Western powers, such as the United States, would have to end, would have to cease. There has to be a paradigm shift in the philosophy of entitlement that Jewish people, despite the centuries upon centuries of struggle that Jewish people have survived, the end that is that I foresee, the futurism that I conceive, is one where Jewish folks abandon the desire or the aspiration for having a nationalistic identity, nationalism, as framed in the 21st century as it is, with a specific flag or a sense of identity that is assigned to specific borders. So that has to end. Also, full adherence to international law as governed by the United Nations, which promises a right of return to refugees, complete abolishment of the military state and the occupation, as well as the system of apartheid that Israel has been responsible for decades now, as well as essentially reparations. And so reparations for the damage that has been caused to the Palestinian people, whether living in Palestine proper or the diaspora, the descendants of which total 5 million people around that figure at this point.
Wow.
So I mean, it is possible. There is an end in sight. It has a lot to do with also just adherence to pure Jewish principles as opposed to a political ideology that was created less than 100 or a little over 100 years ago. There are so many things that can be done, but they are possible.
Yeah. Well. All right. So the road is long, but the conflict doesn't have to go on forever if people take the right steps.
It does not. Correct.
How likely do you think that is right now?
At this present time, for the most part, given that Israel is governed by right-wing government currently, the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, is Israel's prime minister, is currently in power, and so it is. And
they're very take it back,
very right-wing, very. There's that sense of nationalistic entitlement that I was referring to before. So that's very strong. But I mean, the Palestinian resistance, there are nonviolent movements that still currently exist through boycott, divestment, and sanctions. My fear is that the vilification of the Jewish people through settler colonialism under the banner of Judaism will still continue, and Jewish folks will still, unfortunately, continue to see hostility given this. But that's another story for another day and another time.
I mean, it really, this to tie this back around, this kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier about how, really what people need to do is stop blaming the individuals, look at the system as the system that it is, and work on gently tweaking the system instead of getting mad at each other, because it's not each other's fault. It's this system that in this case was put in place by colonialism, by the British and French, and is now being probably continued by, I assume, Russian and American arms dealers.
Precisely. I mean, that is absolutely correct. It's looking less at the individuals, at Jewish Israelis as complicit or guilty, and looking at the system that is being put into place that provides that degree of current privilege, not erasing the years of marginalization that Jewish folk have endured as well, which is a source of that sense of empowerment.
Yeah. So we got to keep the empowerment, but without the entitlement.
There you go. It's the simplest way to philosophize.
Oh wow, Sammy, we solved the world's problems.
Oh, there you go.
Great.
Yeah,
obviously
just in
not,
one sentence.
Yeah. Okay, well, good. I mean, I hope humanity collectively works on that. Sammy, you were so fascinating. I would love to take hours and just get your thoughts on all of the religions that you've studied and hear more about the spoken word community. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today. But thank you very much for being on Canadian Love, for sharing your insights and your struggles. We really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's much appreciated as well. Thank you.
Thank you.